It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. We seem to have lost our title music. I will introduce our guests instead. With me today, Conservative MP Richard Holden, SNP MP Alison Thewlis, Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery and President of the National Union of Students Larissa Kennedy. Today, Priti Patel says migrants crossing the Channel by boat could start being turned back at sea. But will it happen?
It is an indication, frankly, of the Home Secretary's own failure.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock.
After voting for a significant tax rise, are the Conservatives still the party of low taxation?
The Conservative Party, at some stage in our lifetimes, is going to have to rediscover what it stands for.
Also today, will you soon need to show a vaccine passport to go to a football match in Scotland? And will the government be able to walk the walk when it comes to its so-called levelling up agenda?
We have a saying in the North East, half a loaf's better than none.
So, as you heard in the headlines, the government comfortably won last night's vote to raise national insurance by 1.25 percentage points for both employees and employers, despite serious misgivings from many Conservative MPs. Let's just show everyone this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Alistair Heath writing, certainly with both barrels, real Tories will never forgive Boris for turning his party into blue Labour. Richard, with a hand on heart, can you say the Conservatives are still the party of low taxation?
No, absolutely. I think we really are. But I think we've also the party of honest taxation. We know that there's going to have to be more money spent over the next few years to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and the knock-on effects that's had for our NHS and waiting lists. And that's what we voted for yesterday. And also we're looking at that long-term issue of social care and starting to work towards dealing with that as well.
So there's been a rebranding. You're no longer low taxation, it's honest taxation. I heard fair taxation.
No, I think we are the party of low tax, but I think we're also the party who are going to be honest with people. We're not going to make unfunded spending commitments. We're going to say this is what we want to do, and the coronavirus pandemic has changed everything for us.
Obviously, Tim, you will know that Boris Johnson had to reassure backbenchers, Tory backbenchers at the 1922 committee meeting that they are still that party of low taxation. Do you agree?
I admire Richard's chutzpah, first of all, to actually say, after the Tories have just absolutely broken a very clear election pledge on taxation, that the Tories are the party of honest taxation. Of course, there's been an unexpected pandemic, but a lot of the funding that was announced by the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Health Secretary the other day is for things like the NHS and long-term care that we already knew existed before the last election. And it's very hard when its HS2 costs are out of control, when the track and trace system has been out of control, when people are getting telephone number salaries for consultations for the government, to really believe that this Conservative Party is being sensible or prudent with the public money. And if you're not prudent with the public money, you can't be the party of low or honest taxation.
Right. I mean, Alison, your view, yes, on whether the Conservatives are still the party of low taxation, but welcoming the money, I presume, that going to the NHS?
Well, they certainly can't call themselves the party of low taxation or indeed fair taxation, because it's very clear that this national insurance hike will affect young people disproportionately, less well-off people disproportionately, and that is completely unfair and completely unjustifiable in my view. You're not looking at something that's progressive here in any way. And it will damage the recovery as well, because you've got taxation paid by employers too, which will inhibit them taking on new employees, getting people into work, promoting people and trying to build that recovery after the really difficult year that we've had.
How would you raise that sort of money, £12 billion a year, fairly?
There's a whole range of different mechanisms that you could use. I mean, even if this were to go on income tax rather than a national insurance, it would be fairer than the national insurance rise itself. You could also look perhaps even at wealth taxes, as has been suggested by some, because the very wealthiest...
Would you support that?
I think it's certainly something that is worth looking at, because you've got the situation here where people who are landlords are not going to pay, but their poor working tenants are going to have to pay through the nose for it.
Right, Larissa, in terms of graduates, it's been reported today that someone leaving university on more than £27,250 a year in their first job will pay more than 42% marginal rate in tax. What's your reaction?
This is an incredibly difficult time for recent graduates. You know, we are paying extortionate rents when it comes to looking at those who are just over that threshold, have struggled financially through the pandemic. Many of our peers are looking at high levels of unemployment, and it's just an incredibly difficult time generally in terms of the job market and our prospects. And so it seems completely kind of fathomable that this government are putting the burden of the funding that we of course need for our services on young people and those on low income. You know, you asked Jo, you asked Alison there, like, what are the options? How could we otherwise raise this money? But of course, this is a political ploy because the government had a number of other options. They could have chose to bring capital gains tax in line with income tax and a number of other measures that they could have taken, but instead they've put the buck at young people's door, and it's just not good enough.
There's a lot of criticism there for you, Richard. What's your response?
I think, you know, Alison and I will be paying over £900 a year more tax. Somebody on the national living wage in my constituency will be paying about £80 a year more tax. I think that's pretty progressive. Somebody very high earners will be paying even more than that. It's really interesting as well that, you know, we're not really seeing what Labour would say either to this. Lots of hypothecation about what people would actually like to do, but nobody else, none of the other parties are coming forwards with a plan. And I think what we have to do for the fairness for everybody is to try and tackle those waiting lists which are going to result from the coronavirus pandemic. My constituents want to see that tackled, and I think, you know, me paying £900, my mum, who's a part-time worker in the NHS, paying £40 a year extra. I think those are pretty fair and pretty progressive tax rises.
All right, well, let's turn to the front page of the Daily Express. Migrants will be turned back to France. These are migrants that make that dangerous crossing over the Channel. There was a meeting with the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, with her French counterpart. They didn't agree this new strategy that she is now authorising the Border Force to turn back boats carrying migrants across the English Channel before they reach the UK, only, though, in very limited legal circumstances. And there will be, obviously, conditions. The numbers at the moment, more than 1,500 migrants have crossed the English Channel this week by boat. Richard, the government says it's only going to be used in a limited way. Experts have been pouring cold water on it all morning, and the French currently say no. So is this just tough talk for Priti Patel trying to save her career?
Well, quite frankly, I think my constituents, many people across the country, are really fed up of seeing these boats crossing the Channel. I think we've got fair and safe legal migration routes. That's what I want to see the government concentrating on, and I want to see the government concentrating on stopping these boats in the Channel. I think people are fed up of seeing people just rocking up on our shores. And if Priti,
so you support the policy of turning?
I absolutely do, and I want to see this taken, you know, properly, and we need to stop it happening.
Alison?
I think this is absolutely abhorrent and inhumane policy. I think it's absolutely awful, and that people will lose their lives in the Channel as a result of it. People who have fled from wars, from torture, from seeing their families tortured and raped, are being turned away in the Channel by the Home Secretary, and I think that is absolutely despicable.
We need to see the boat stopped. The only way we can stop people dying in the Channel is if people aren't in the Channel. Unfortunately, if we take an approach that says, oh, you can still come by a boat, people are going to die in the Channel. We need to stop those boats in the Channel and make it an unviable option for people to travel. That's the only way we'll stop people dying.
Because there is no other safe way to get here. I have the highest immigration caseload in Scotland in my constituency, and I see many desperate people at my surgeries who have had to take those risks because they cannot get here any other way.
Why would they want to come from a safe country like France?
They want to come here because perhaps their families live here. If you have your last remaining family member living in my constituency, you will do anything to get to them.
There
if
are
you
safe
have
and
lost
legal migration routes
there
for
are
people to
not.
join their family.
Well, let's just make that clear. There is a UK resettlement scheme, isn't there, if you do have family connections?
It is very limited, that scheme, in the way in which it operates. And I have constituents who have been told that their child cannot get here because they're a day over the age of 18. If you're over 18, somehow the Home Office thinks that that person is somehow not your child any longer. And I've had to sit with a father in my surgery, and he was in tears because he couldn't bring his son here because the Home Office rules prohibited that.
The answer to that is not to allow people in the... It's not to see people dying in the Channel.
What happens to his son if he is left in that unsafe country on his own? What does that boy then do? He gets recruited by some of the terrorists in that country because that's the only option that child then has to stay safe. He ends up dead because he has no further option.
I don't understand why, if you can get safe haven in France, why you can't stay there. It seems perfectly reasonable. I don't understand why people are travelling through perfectly safe countries to then try and get to the UK.
With their families.
Well, as has been said, there are...
Well, then is the strategy working if you haven't got the support and agreement of the French?
Well, we have to. I know the French have been doing some stuff to work on this, but I think we have to also stop these boats in the Channel, because it's actually a problem for France if people are travelling through France and then trying to get boats. If we can stop the boat route, then that will be a major benefit, not just to the UK, but also to France.
All right. Well, on this point about working with the French, Tim and Larissa. But Tim, first of all, I'm just going to show our viewers this tweet from my colleague Nick Beak. Not much room for misunderstanding the message from Priti Patel's counterpart on the UK's plans to turn back migrant boats into French waters. France, this is Gérard Darmanin, says we will not accept any practice that breaks maritime law nor any financial blackmail. That's referring to Priti Patel reportedly holding back the £54 million that she was going to give to the French to help them stop people getting into boats. The UK's commitment must be kept. Is this ever going to happen, this turning back policy that's been announced, Tim?
No. I'm outraged, as I suspect lots of viewers of this programme are, that our borders are so porous, that people are able to come across the Channel through illegal and dangerous routes organised by people smugglers. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, and the government as a whole, that we've established some pretty generous, ambitious refugee policies, resettlement policies, for example, from people from Hong Kong, from people recently for Afghanistan. That is the right way to resettle people from dangerous parts of the world or persecuted parts of the world, and to have a zero tolerance policy for the kind of Channel crossings. But this policy will not work. Admiral West, someone who knows what he's talking about, has talked about the danger of trying to turn boats around. And certainly if the French aren't cooperating, the policy has no chance of success at all. I think we need to get a lot tougher with the French, though. Why on earth we are sending them money when they are clearly not using that money properly to stop boats crossing? I don't know. I think we probably need to escalate this to prime ministerial and president level. It's clearly not working as it currently is. I think Boris Johnson should be meeting Emmanuel Macron. We have lots of other business to do between our two nations post the Afghanistan crisis. I think there needs to be more French-British cooperation. But I think until heads of government address this issue, we won't see any progress at all.
I mean, Richard, do you agree there with Tim? It's not going to happen. It won't work for all the reasons that have been set out. Does it need to be escalated to Prime Minister and presidential level?
I'm absolutely certain that over time the Prime Minister and President Macron will have talked about this issue. And I actually think that we need to look at all options here. It's quite clear that the current system isn't working. We're still seeing those migrant boats, and anything, including what the Home Secretary has suggested today, needs to be looked at in order to stop that cross-channel migration and people dying in the Channel.
Larissa, what's your reaction? These are illegal routes, of course, and it is dangerous to make that crossing in the first instance. But your response to the idea that some boats, in very limited circumstances, could be turned back?
I think if we're talking about illegality, we need to be thinking about the fact that Priti Patel and the approach that she has continually taken to asylum seekers and refugees flies in the face of international law. And actually, that is the area of what is illegal that I think we need to be paying attention to. The onus is on this government to ensure that people have and can access safe routes to asylum and to refugee status. Of course, we've seen those routes time and time again fail people to the point where, we've got this political political climate now that is so disastrous for those who are fleeing some really difficult, really harmful situations, which none of us as human beings would ever want to have to experience in our lifetimes. And in fact, this is just a nail in the coffin when it comes to this government's and specifically Priti Patel's approach to, humane ways of treating other human beings.
Tim?
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Tim?
Well, I agree with a lot of that. We have to be a country that respects international law, but I think there's a lack of generosity actually to Priti Patel. Priti Patel, there weren't many people who did really very well during the Afghan crisis, but Priti Patel really streamlined Home Office procedures to help get as many Afghan people who'd supported us during that crisis into Britain. The policies she's introduced for Hong Kong people holding a British passport has been amazingly fast and generous as well. We only have confidence, though, in those legal routes to resettle in Britain if we police the channel and informal channels properly. And I think we need to be a little bit more supportive of what the Home Secretary is doing in this area.
Well, you're shaking your head, Alison. I mean, it's true the UK is committed to accepting thousands of people from Afghanistan via 2 schemes, in fact. Are you saying that everybody should be able to cross the Channel and be taken into the UK on humanitarian grounds? Everybody who wants to and does cross there should be taken in.
I think there should be safe and legal routes for people to come here. I
No,
don't think
but that's not my question. Because you are against the boats being turned back. I get that, and we've said they may not happen as such. But are you saying that people who do make that crossing and do successfully reach the shores of the UK should be accepted and taken in?
I think all of their applications should be looked at and processed properly and fully in accordance with the law. Because I think what is important here is that the government, with its Immigration and Borders Bill, is setting up a process by which you've got a 2-tier system of the people that the government likes and want to bring in, and the other people that have arrived on our shores in some other way. And those people are being criminalised and penalised for fleeing very difficult circumstances in a way which is just unacceptable and stands against all of the sort of international protocols we've signed up to in refugees.
Richard?
I'm afraid Labour and the SNP seem to have the same policy, which is if you can get here, then you can stay.
That's not what I said.
It's absolutely
That's not
outrageous
what I said for a second.
that we have a situation where people are coming in the Channel and both the main opposition parties in the UK are not prepared to take the action that's required in order to stop those illegal flows.
Right, but you yourself have just said something's got to be done because the policy isn't working. So would you accept that the existing policy, every attempt by Priti Patel and to some extent the French side too, haven't worked?
Well, exactly. We need robust borders, which is exactly what the government's looking at doing now, making it even more robust on the Channel issue, because we've had and we've got the Immigration and Borders Bill coming through at the moment as well to toughen up deportations from people who shouldn't be here from the UK. I think this approach the government's taking is exactly the right one, because my constituents want to see us controlling our own borders and choosing who comes here.
Right, just before we move on, you don't have support across your party because actually yesterday Andrea Leadsom, former Cabinet Minister, who was on the programme, actually said we shouldn't be turning back boats on humanitarian grounds. Is she wrong?
I don't agree with Andrea Leadsom on that at all. I think we need to have a robust borders policy, and if that means we can, and also to stop people dying in the Channel, and if that means turning the boats around, then that's what we should do.
Let's talk about vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations, because the government is launching a consultation into compulsory COVID and flu jabs for frontline NHS and care workers in England today. Now, there are plans already in place to make it mandatory for care home workers in England to be fully vaccinated, and from November those working in care homes in England regulated by the Care Quality Commission need to be double jabbed unless they are medically exempt. Richard, do you think expanding the requirement for vaccinations in the health sector is the right approach?
I think we've seen doctors, surgeons already need hepatitis B vaccinations if they're doing that. I think in the circumstances of providing health and social care, I think it's really important that people are vaccinated. Absolutely.
What about the issue of recruitment? Could put people off?
I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think we see people really pushing back on that. I think it's if people are providing health and social care services, then we need to really be protecting people in those environments.
Do you agree with mandatory vaccinations for health and care workers?
I'm slightly nervous about that because it may put some of those people off entirely. They may decide that they don't want to work in that sector anymore. And I think it's better to have people understand why it's so important that they get vaccinated, not just for themselves, but for the people that they're looking after. And everything that we've done so far has been to persuade and to encourage and to support people to make the right choice and the right decision there for the people.
Right, so you wouldn't want to see it happen?
I personally would be a bit nervous about that,
right.
because I think some of the evidence around that would suggest that that's not the best way to go around it.
Tim?
Well, let's be clear. Of course, you can be vaccinated and you can still pass on the virus. Just having people vaccinated doesn't actually protect the patients of medical staff or care home staff. So the question is, what is the best way really of increasing the number of people who are willing to take the vaccine? And there is some evidence that actually making it compulsory encourages actually a suspicion amongst those who haven't yet been willing to take the vaccine. They think, why are they forcing me to take this vaccine? And actually, it might therefore be counterproductive as a policy. So I think we need a pragmatic approach to this. I think it's sensible that the government is consulting rather than rushing into a position. But, I know in Salisbury, where I live, I know a couple of wonderful care home staff who are brilliant carers, and they are completely opposed to the vaccine. I don't happen to agree with them, but I would feel we would be definitely going backwards if we lost the care that those kind of people give to the system at the moment.
Larissa?
I think the onus is on the government to give people the access to information that they need, the access to vaccines themselves, so that people can make that choice. Equally, I think it's not the right route to go down to take this kind of punitive approach and forceful approach to vaccinations. But I do think it needs to focus energy on making sure that people have that access and can make those right decisions so that we can keep everyone safe.
All right, well, let's move on to vaccine passports, because, Alison, MSPs, as you know, will today vote on the Scottish Government's plans to introduce a vaccine passport scheme, which would see nightclubs, large sporting events and gigs close their doors to people who aren't fully vaccinated. The votes today, your Scottish Green colleagues don't like it, do they?
That's for them to decide. I'm not here to speak for the Scottish Green Party, but
but we know they don't like it.
Everybody is looking at the evidence here, looking at what works. This is something that's been rolled out in other countries in Europe as well. They've gone down a very similar road. And what we're looking at here is the highest risk activities, the highest risk venues, and seeing how best can we protect people within those. And vaccine passports are certainly a move towards protecting people in those high risk venues like nightclubs.
Right, well, the co-leader of the Greens in Scotland, Patrick Harvey, doesn't see it that way. Here is a headline in The National: Vaccine passports, inequality will deepen if jab proof is needed. What do you say to him?
I think where we're looking at, we're not putting in these vaccine passports for accessing essential services, health services, and things like that.
He still thinks it's discriminatory.
Going to a nightclub is an option. Nobody has to go to a nightclub. Nobody has to go to a football match. And I think those are choices that people have to weigh up for themselves. Is it worth me getting my double vaccination, protecting myself, protecting those round about me, and having the vaccine passport to prove that you've had those vaccinations so that you can go about your life, or not to do so? Right.
Do you still understand some of the practical and ethical concerns around it?
Yes, and I have lots of nightclubs in my constituency, and I go to the football, and I appreciate, it's difficult to get people through turnstiles at the football, but I think these are things that are being managed all around the world, and people are looking at these challenges and looking at a way through them, and I think it is the best way of trying to keep people safe.
Do you think it is, Richard?
Personally, I think, I'm a massive believer in freedom. That's what's most important for me. I want to ensure that people have a choice. I think, if people can test or vaccinate, or if they've had symptoms, that's something, and they've got those antibodies in their system, then that's one thing. But I think forcing vaccination in a wide-scale way outside the health and social care sector, I think that's not the way I'd like to go.
Right, so you support your colleagues in Scotland. Douglas Ross has written here, MSP, head of the Scottish Tories. The Scottish Tories will vote against vaccine passports today. The SNP's plans are a shambles. There are still no answers to any of the key questions on infrastructure, administration, fraud enforcement and data concerns. I will go back to you in just a moment, but do you agree with him? You do.
I think it's utter hypocrisy from Douglas Ross. It's absolutely astonishing that his government, that he's a member of this party as an MP and an MSP, he's a member on the government benches in the parliament that we sit in, where he'll be asked to vote for it, and he's campaigning against it in Scotland. It's utter hypocrisy from him. It's absolutely wild.
Right, well, that's true, isn't it? Because actually the rollout of vaccine passports in England is going to happen, isn't it?
As I've said, I think if you're looking at either vaccination or testing or antibodies in the system, that's one thing. I think it's totally different what's being looked at in Scotland here. It's an enforceable jab from what I understand.
No.
Right, is it?
It's a very similar scheme, broadly.
I mean, Larissa, what about students? Are they broadly supportive of vaccine passports?
I think the preoccupation with vaccine passports feels like a way of eclipsing lots of other preventative measures that the government could and should be taking. If you're thinking about kind of students and education, we have a number of folks who are currently 17 who will be going to university shortly who don't currently have access. Of course, lots of college students are 16 and 17 and don't have access to vaccines. Lots of our educational institutions are both further and higher education mixed together in the same space, and so those young people who still don't have access to the vaccine are looking at all of this discussion and thinking, why is this the focus as opposed to access for young people?
Right, and in terms of the scheme, I mean, here in front of me, Richard, from the end of September, passports in England are expected to be used for crowded indoor spaces such as nightclubs and music venues, exactly the same as the proposal from the SNP, large outdoor events such as festivals, is that the same?
Not quite sure on the festival.
All right, and some very large business and spectator sport events. In essence, it's the same.
Well, that will need to see the full proposals from the government, which haven't been published yet. But I want to see testing as part of that, so there's a choice, and also antibodies, which is and those are different things compared to what's being proposed.
Well, except that hasn't been proposed so far, as I understand it, in terms of testing. So will you be voting against it?
Neither has been. Well, we'll see what the government comes forwards with.
Right, but you will be if there aren't those caveats in there.
I want to see testing as an option as well.
Otherwise, you'll vote against it.
Otherwise, I'll vote against it.
Right, Tim. Well, there we have it from Richard. He won't support it unless there are those parts of it being included. I mean, yesterday, even the vaccines minister, Tim Nadeem Zahawi, said it goes against everything I believe in, but nevertheless, it's the right thing to do.
Well, I don't agree with Nadeem on that particular issue. I think there are too many people, perhaps in Britain and in some of our health authorities, who've got used to having a little bit too much power during the COVID crisis, and they're unwilling to relinquish it. If you look at some of the industries that have been clobbered most during this crisis, it is things like the entertainment industry, the nightclub sector, and the outside entertainment industry. And if we're going to impose a big restriction on civil liberties like this, we have to be sure that the advantage is worth it. And actually, in both of these sort of instances, we're dealing with groups that are largely outside, where transmission is low, for example, football matches. And then we're dealing with nightclubs, etc., which is overwhelmingly used by young people who are much less vulnerable to the disease. So I don't think the risk of infection or of a serious risk of infection is justifies imposing such a restriction on people's liberty.
Richard, do you think the government's going to struggle with this to get it through?
No, I think it's going to include testing, and that's what I want to see.
All right, Larissa, let's go back to students and young people. Tim talking about it there. Are you happy more broadly with how universities are preparing for students' return?
I think, we're looking towards the return, and it's really welcome to see that things are much different than last year. But there are still lots of questions to be answered about, the blended learning approach that lots of people are about, where many students will be receiving partly in-person and partly online teaching. How are we going to make sure that we see the investment into digital infrastructure that we need to make sure that online learning is truly accessible? How are we going to make sure that disabled students and working class students aren't left behind once again? And how do we make sure that the kind of experience of university, which of course extends far beyond the curriculum and teaching itself, is met for students?
Right.
Because a lot of students have not received that over not only the past year, but the year before that too now.
Right, so is it justifiable in your mind for the fees to still stand at £9,250 if that unique learning experience at university isn't happening? Can universities really justify more online lectures?
I think what this has exposed is that fees in and of themselves are not justifiable, because we have an education system where we act as though students are these customers in the market of education. But what this has exposed and exacerbated, the pandemic has shown us, is that in fact education is a public service, it is a public good, and it's not some kind of custom that you can buy and sell and get a return for.
All right.
So I think we need to re-envision how we approach the funding of education, and the government should be moving towards fully funded, lifelong and truly accessible education.
But in terms of the post sort of COVID pandemic, I know it's not gone completely, Tim, but should more be done by the government to compel universities to get in-person tuition back?
Definitely. I thought it was slightly funny today that Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, was encouraging universities to provide in-person teaching from a remote link. So we're all suffering still from having this problem. But yes, generally, I think students are getting a raw deal at the moment. They're paying huge fees. They're getting themselves into big debt over the course of their lifetime, and they aren't getting the quality of the teaching that they deserve. And I think there should be some sort of compensation for them because of that. Right,
well, let's just show that tweet as you refer to it there. Gavin Williamson doesn't turn up in person to Universities UK conference in Newcastle, but uses his video link speech to warn universities to get back to in-person teaching. Richard, should he have been there in person?
Well, I don't know why wasn't there. I imagine it was because his votes in Parliament yesterday. Quite frankly, I think universities should be going back to in-person teaching. What we've seen over the last few weeks, actually, a couple of universities have been renting out their lecture halls to corporate events, but not having them in-person teaching.
So what should the government do about it? Can they compel them?
I think through the Office for Students, we really need to be pressurising the universities to get back to in-person teaching, because that's what students are paying for.
Larissa?
But I think we also need to remember that there are immunocompromised and disabled students and young people who are, of course, nervous about the fact that this government has essentially washed its hands of higher education. It continually, whenever we raise the complications and the need for more funding for the proper the infrastructure in place to keep things safe, to make sure that in-person provision is safe, we are consistently told that, you know, universities are their own individual entities and need to deal with that on a case-by-case basis, which, of course, just isn't good enough. And we're going to get into a situation, unless the government steps up, where, you know, depending on which institution you attend, your safety is differently approached. And I think that's just a kind of ridiculous situation to be approaching without the proper funding from government to make sure that students, but also staff and local communities, are kept safe as we approach the autumn term.
Richard?
No, I think actually there's a bigger picture here, and one of the things I've been most keen on from my constituency over the last few months has been looking at lifelong learning, something which I think has been a major issue locally, which is to try and upskill people, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic and afterwards. The jobs market is changing, and I think that's the concentration I want to see on, particularly those people who haven't got those level 3 qualifications in the first place. I think the government's moved in the right direction on that, and that's the direction I like to see it moving now.
More in-person teaching at universities, Alison?
Yeah, very much looking forward to seeing universities going back in my constituency just now.
Right, compelling them to do so and not have it online?
I don't think, again, compulsion in this would be necessarily helpful for everybody for the reasons that have been set out by Larissa there, but I think for practical subjects, there's a different issue as well. So I've got Glasgow School of Art and the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in my constituency, lots of practical courses there as well. So I'm very keen to see them all returning just now.
All right, I have a question for you. What is levelling up? It is a question we often ask. Here's Alex Forsyth.
Gone to pot, really. All the shops are closing.
Well, they're not great, are they?
There's nothing open anymore. It's crap.
It's changed a lot, hasn't it? The town centre.
It's a refrain often heard in high streets. Stockton Town Centre, like so many, has seen shops close as retail's moved out of town or online, all made worse by the pandemic. Here, though, the council has grand plans to turn things round. It's going to knock down this whole shopping centre and replace it with an urban park.
We'd be walking across this bridge in just a few years' time, and just to the right of us, we're going to see a wonderful new park. We're going to have some modern, fit-for-purpose, lean green buildings. It is giving people back a town centre to be proud of.
The Labour councils had funding for the scheme from the region's Conservative mayor and the Conservative government, all part of its promise to help areas that have felt overlooked.
For this scheme, we've had 16.5 million off the government. We asked them for 24, but they came in at 16.5. But we have a saying in the North East, half a loaf's better than none, so we grabbed that.
Is that what you want from government? Do you think it's going to make a difference? Is it enough?
What I would say to the government is, yes, your injection of capital is welcome, and we'll do our best to match fund that. But what we really need is revenue, rather than having to ask for a handout from Westminster, to actually get the money coming in and local people decide how best to use that money.
This idea that the government calls levelling up is one of Boris Johnson's key promises to the country, an attempt to address regional inequalities, to improve your lot no matter where you live. More detail about what it really means is expected in a white paper in the autumn. But one element so far has been pots of money for high streets, town centres, infrastructure schemes, transport projects. The question is, what lasting difference will that make? And how do you measure success?
Head to Coventry, and the city's undergoing huge regeneration. From a brand new train station to new office space, hotels, cycle routes and walkways. In the city centre, the transformation's already obvious, with more to come. A multi-million-pound redevelopment with less retail, more housing, cafes and leisure space. The Labour council's keen to point out this has been in train for years, with no funding from recent so-called levelling up schemes. But they do think getting the high street right can make a real difference.
You bring people into the city centre, both in terms of they pay rent, they pay council tax, that then is reinvested into services and actually trying to make our city centre as the most attractive place to be. And it's a virtuous circle. If you actually invest, you actually look after something, people actually take care of it and actually enjoy it, they spend money, that creates jobs and everybody is a winner.
Of course, Coventry's economic outlook was bright before the pandemic and has had a big boost by being this year's City of Culture.
Right, we got our tickets.
That's brought attention, investment and, for these young apprentices, opportunity.
I think it's created a lot of energy around the city. Coventry wasn't like this before. City of Culture has made a lot of difference.
It's not just the events that we're putting on, we're working with community members, so once the City of Culture title is gone, that they can carry on the legacy.
The region's Conservative mayor has invested in the event and the city's wider regeneration and believes it can bring lasting change.
Ultimately, this is about where are the jobs going to come from for the future. And do you know, before the pandemic, we'd already got to a point in Coventry where unemployment was below the national average. Then you actually see the physical infrastructure investments like the new railway station, you see investment in housing, and of course you see the investment in new facilities in the city centre that people will use. So there's lots of part of the jigsaw that come together.
How do you take what's happened here in Coventry, a city that was doing fairly well economically anyway, and replicate that in some of the towns which are struggling?
I think the key to what's happened here is actually about gluing it all together. And exactly the same is being tried in the towns and cities of the Black Country. So you do need to have an economic strategy that is at the heart of this, and then the physical regeneration will, in a sense, come on the back of that. And that's what levelling up is about.
Coventry might have been the original ghost town, but it's a city set on transforming its fortunes. It knows, though, it takes more than just window dressing.
Richard, what's your metric of success for this levelling up process?
For me, it's really about one major thing overall, which is more good, well-paid jobs in my patch in the future. So I was really pleased to have the Prime Minister up in Nissan recently, looking at that next generation manufacturing. You can see down over in Teesside, Ben Houchin, you've got the Teesport there, looking at huge investment from the private sector to create those jobs.
And if they don't come, it'll be a failure.
That's exactly right, I think, overall. What we need to see is those good, well-paid jobs. That's what my constituents are after.
Right, and bids are in?
I've got some bids in for specific projects as well, Jo. So, please...
you don't have to run them through. I'll just take your word that they're in. Tim, is that how you understand it? It's all about well-paid jobs, more of them?
I think that's true. I think the tension is we need long-term investment in infrastructure. And obviously the government has political objectives, and some of the long-term projects won't necessarily, even though the money might go into them now, they won't be evident to voters until after the election. So, the temptation for government is to perhaps spend on sort of short-term paid job type projects that don't deliver the kind of jobs that Richard quite rightly prioritises. I think the magic subject that should be absolute the priority for the government is broadband. Broadband. That's the sort of one issue that we can deliver some progress on very quickly before the next election, and will make all sorts of jobs well outside of London and the South East much more viable for people. So I would be prioritising that if I was in government at the moment.
Alison?
I mean, at the moment, your bids are going in from Scotland, but it's all just a wee bit unclear, actually, what the criteria are, what's the best way to go about applying for things, what the metrics of success of the Levelling Up Fund will actually be as well. And I'm not quite sure that it's the best way to deliver those strategic projects that will make a real long-term difference.
What would you do instead?
I mean, I think the way in which it's set up at the moment just doesn't make it clear, actually, what's a good project, what's not a good project. And I think it might not end up being the best use of money. As Tim's suggesting, you might end up with big shiny projects which don't actually deliver those jobs on the ground. And you need to look at that on a more strategic, more long-term basis in order to get that kind of success.
Larissa, do you know what it means, really, in layman's terms, levelling up? Does it mean anything to you?
To me, levelling up feels like a farce. It feels like trying to pave over what years of austerity has done to particularly working class communities, and where there are now kind of particularly newly elected Tory MPs and councils. It feels like a bid to win over the continued favour of those areas. And so with the Levelling Up Fund, where we've seen a disproportionate impact on those communities, I just hope that as we move forward, there will be a fairer access to that for all communities. And having been a resident of Coventry for a long time as a student, it's very difficult to hear that areas like Coventry, where there of course are Labour MPs, are having to resource that themselves and find that money locally and find investments themselves, as opposed to seeing the needed infrastructure and support from government.
Richard?
Well, I think there's two things here. One is levelling up overall. The other is the specifics of the Levelling Up Fund. Every area, every MP can bid in for the Levelling Up Fund. I'm going to be putting a bid in the next few weeks. I've already got some bids in for restoring your railways funds. That's really important. But I think the overall thing, what we want to see, that real difference in levelling up, is those good long-term jobs. I had the business secretary in my patch a few weeks ago talking exactly about that. I've got a jobs fair in my patch in the next few weeks. Companies like Irwin-Heimer, big local employer, will be there. I want to see those good long-term jobs. That's what my constituents are going to judge me on.
Sure, I can see what you're doing in the strategy now, but has Larissa got a point that it is paving over or making up for the pain and damage done by austerity?
No, I don't think so. This is about transforming communities, which often for 40 or 50 years have felt that they're not getting a fair deal, and it's about delivering those jobs there so that people don't feel that they have to move away to other parts of the country to be able to get on for themselves, their families and for their community.
Larissa?
I agree that the need for transformation comes from a lack of funding and underfunding of these communities over the past decade, where this government has been in power.
Right. Tim, do you agree with Larissa?
I have a lot of sympathy with what she said. We could look at the roots of austerity, but that's another debate.
Yes.
One thing I would add to the debate that we're having today is just don't neglect the rural areas, parts of the West Country, parts of Wales. I think there's an understandable focus on seats that Richard represents, the red wall seats in the north, etc. But there are plenty of other seats, and a lot of poverty is actually concentrated in some farming and rural communities, and they perhaps don't have the power of voice in government that I think that they need. So it's a broader problem than just a north-south divide, much more complicated.
But do you think it'll work, Tim?
It will work if you have It's the serious long-term investment rather than the paint job schemes.
Right. What about rural communities and areas outside?
Well, perhaps Tim doesn't really understand what North West Durham's like.
I was going to say, your area is...
I stretch from the middle of the Pennines to 3 miles outside Durham city centre, so you come up and visit. But actually, a lot of those smaller communities, those smaller former pit villages, those smaller places like, Concert's not massive. It's only about 20,000 people the whole area around Concert. So, this is actually about transforming those towns and villages, which often, away from those major urban centres, do feel they've been left behind, and that's places like where I represent.
Right, well, you made that point well. That's it. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests today. I'll be back next week.